The following is a dynamic playlist sorted by date, published, newest. It's a politics quick pick in our culture commentary series titled Politics 3 Quick Pick. Enjoy the content. Enjoy every title and thumbnail. Now to the content. Let me tell you how I ended up with the vocabulary that no one else uses. Not because I sat down one day and decided to coin terms, not because I wanted to make things harder than they needed to be, but because I kept running into concepts that felt real functional concepts that the existing language just didn't have a strong enough container for. And when you spend enough time as a content consumer, a serious content consumer, a high intensity content consumer, you start noticing things that the standard vocabulary doesn't see. So you do what any careful thinker does. You name what you're seeing, and then you use that name. That's what this session is about. I'm going to walk you through 3 of the most load-bearing terms in the As an Aggregator framework: consume digest, hypergraph, and linguistic point plane vector. I'm going to tell you where each one came from, why I needed it, and why the existing alternatives didn't cover what I was actually talking about. And then I'm going to be honest with you about what it means that this vocabulary is hard, who it's for, and what it loses if you try to translate it into plain language. The answer to that last question is everything. But let me start at the beginning. Let's start with the term that came first, not necessarily in time frame, but in order of the grounds, the whole framework. Let's start with consume digest. To understand where consume digest came from, you have to understand something about how I got into content creation in the first place. When it started with a question that is, on its surface, a very ordinary question. What is my psychological type? If you spent any time in that world, the Myers-Briggs world, the Jungian typology world, you're familiar with the Grant function stack. The idea that each psychological function is composed of a hierarchy of psychological functions ordered from most dominant to most suppressed, or most superior to most inferior, depending on the level of resolution the function can have as a metastabilization framework of the function substrate itself as it collates in terms of your direction for it, in terms of adaptation and compensation. So the idea that each psychological type is composed of a hierarchy of psychological functions ordered from most to least, most dominant to least inferior, and that this hierarchy shapes how you perceive and process reality. But I didn't stop at MBTI, I kept going. I found the objective personality system. And what objective personality did was take the Grant function stack and go deeper into the mechanics of how those functions actually operate together, specifically through what they call animal functions or action functions. Here's what an animal function is. In the objective personality system, the functions don't just operate independently, they pair up. A decider function pairs with an observer function, either in an introverted context or an extroverted context. And when they pair, they produce a new mode of operation, a new behavioral pattern that has a name. One of those animal functions is called consume. And when I came across that word, consume, as a technical term in a typological system, something clicked. Because I had a word for what I had been doing all this time. Not just watching content, not just having a media diet, not just accumulating a watch history, consuming in a specific, psychologically grounded sense of that word. And then I extended it. Because what I realized was that my engagement with content isn't just consume as a verb, it's also a noun. The body of what I have consumed. The accumulated record of encounters with ideas, arguments, creators, playlists, thumbnails, and it's an architecture. The organized residue of both the consuming and the body. Not a library, not a history, not a diet, a digest. And that word is doing its own work here. Think about what Reader's Digest originally meant: a condensed, a curated reduction of a larger body of material into something navigable, something that preserved the essential signal. So that's the second half of the term. So when you put them together, consume, carrying the psychological heuristic from objective personality, and digest, carrying this sense of organized, curated residue, you get a term that is simultaneously a verb, a noun, and an architecture. 3 dimensions, 1 container, and no existing term covers all 3 at once. Media diet, it's media and diet. It doesn't include the psychological dimension. It doesn't say anything about what kind of consuming is happening or what psychological function is in play. Content consumption, it misses the psychological dimension entirely, and it misses the architectural dimension. Consumption is what happens. It says nothing about what remains, right? We're talking about content consumption. It misses the psychological dimension entirely. It misses the architecture dimension. Consumption is what happens. It says nothing about what remains. Watch history. Watch history is the most limited of all. It's a platform record, a time-stamped plays. It's time-stamped plays. It doesn't include the things you scroll past and never click. It doesn't include scrolling through an Amazon list and registering titles and thumbnails. It doesn't include the moment when you read 45 recommendations and walk away without watching any of them. It doesn't count all of those parts of the cybernetic ecology that you're in, whether it's TikTok scrolling, it's a form of culture commentary in terms of your consume digest. There are so many avenues: bird watching, scrolling through a television guide on broadcast television is a form of a consume digest, right? So it doesn't count all of these different things, and that's still part of your consume digest. Because here's what consume digest catches that those 3 terms all miss. It catches the act of processing as a psychological operation. It catches the body of material you've processed as a structured artifact. And it catches the organized residue of both as an ongoing architecture that's always accumulating, always being revised. More specifically, and this is the objective personality dimension, it catches that there are different flavors of consume. My consume is not a generic consume. It's a specific type of consume that reflects my typological configuration. The specific animal function in play, the specific pairing of decider and observer that shapes how I take in and process information, that's what a consume digest is doing. That's why the 3 alternatives don't reach it. And that's where the term came from. Not from a decision to coin something clever, but from stumbling onto a psychological heuristic that finally gave me a word for something that I was already doing, that I was already a part of. The coinage followed the concept. The concept was already there, already operating, already shaping my behavior. I just finally had language for it. Now let's talk about hypergraph. To understand what hypergraph is doing, you need a brief orientation to graph theory. Not the full academic treatment, just the conceptual foundation. In standard graph theory, you have two prime primitive elements: vertices, which represent entities; nodes, points of existence; people, videos, channels, concepts, anything that occupies a position. So I'll state it again. In standard graph theory, you have two primary elements: vertices, which represent entities; nodes, points of existence; people, videos, channels, concepts, anything that occupies a position. And an edge, which represents relationships, the line that connects one vertex to another. This is how most of our legacy thinking about networks, relationships, and connections is structured. The world as a graph, entities as points, relationships as lines. This is how the standard vocabulary of networks works, and it is genuinely powerful. But here is where the legacy model hits its ceiling. In standard graph theory, an edge is just an edge. A vertex is just a vertex. A line connects exactly 2 points. That is the constraint. And for a long time, most of our theoretical infrastructure was built on that constraint because it was sufficient for the kinds of complexity that we were modeling. And then the world got more complex. And when I encountered Stephen Wolfram's work on the Ruliad, his framework for understanding the computational structure of reality, I encountered the hypergraph as a formal upgrade to that legacy model. Here's what changes in a hypergraph. An edge doesn't have to connect exactly 2 vertices. An edge can connect any number of vertices simultaneously. And critically, an edge can itself be a bundle of edges. A vertex can itself be a bundle of vertices. You're now talking about a relational structure that can represent permutations and recombinations of disparate elements linking together in a lattice that the standard graph model simply cannot express. And I'm sitting there watching Stephen Wolfram explain this in the context of physics, in the context of how reality might be computationally structured. And I'm thinking about YouTube. I'm thinking, what is a video? What is a vertex? Is it an edge? And the immediate answer gets complicated. A video is an entity, so it looks like a vertex. But a video also connects to other videos through a channel, through a playlist, through a search result, through a recommendation. So it looks like an edge. Is the creator a vertex or an edge? A creator exists as an entity, vertex. But a creator also links videos to each other, links concepts to each other across time, an edge. And then I got to playlists. And the playlist is where hypergraph theory becomes not just applicable, but necessary. Because a playlist is neither an edge nor a vertex, it is both at the same time. A playlist is an entity. It has an identity, a name, a structure, a thematic or temporal or intentional logic. Vertex. And a playlist is a relationship. It connects videos to each other, connects the viewer to a sequence of encounters, connects a creator's body of work into a navigable architecture. Edge. It is both simultaneously, without contradiction. And that is exactly what hypergraph theory gives you. Language 4. The thing that is both a point in the network and a relationship within the network, depending on the context from which you're observing it. Standard graph theory cannot express that. The recommendation algorithm cannot see that. And that's a critical distinction, so let me be precise about it. The recommendation algorithm is, in a technical sense, a hypergraph lattice. That is, it's a computational structure connecting users, videos, channels, and behaviors through a web of relationships that absolutely exhibits hypergraph properties at the structural level. That's real. That's true. I'm not disputing the algorithm's complexity, but the algorithm is a synthetic hypergraph. It is a machine-generated lattice that corrects human agents and content surfaces through recommendation signals, publishing links, watch behavior, and engagement patterns. What the As an Aggregator framework is interested in is the human agency hypergraph, the lattice that a conscious, deliberate content consumer builds through their own choices, through playlist construction, through curation, through the intentional linking of content across time. The algorithm shows you what other people are consuming. That is a part of the hypergraph, but it's not the whole hypergraph, and the algorithm cannot see the human-constructed lattice, the one you've built through your consume digest, through your playlist, through your curation decisions. That's what hypergraph describes that feed and recommendation algorithms don't. They're not even in the same conversation. We need to update our lexical scaffolding to include this, because the world has shifted. Most of the relational complexity we are navigating now in content, in culture, in information is hypergraph complexity. And if you're still using legacy graph theory vocabulary to describe it, you're leaving most of what's happening invisible. From the hypergraph, the structural framework, we moved to the operational tool, the thing you actually use when you're curating, the thing that sits at the level of a search term, a playlist title, a keyword, but does far more work than any of those terms suggests. The linguistic point plane vector. I know, it's the most opaque term in the framework, and it's also the one most likely to read as performance rather than precision. So let me make the case for it. Before large language models became the dominant interface for information retrieval, I was doing a deep dive into semantic search, specifically into what the semantic web actually meant, not as a buzzword, but as a technical and epistemological claim about how language operates in computational systems. And in that process, I encountered word-to-vec. Word-to-vec is a technique for representing words as vectors in a high-dimensional mathematical space. The core idea is this. Rather than treating a word as a symbol that stands for a meaning, you treat a word as a point in a space defined by its relationships to every other word in a corpus. Again, rather than treating a word as a meaning, you treat a word as a point in a space defined by its relationships to every other word in a corpus. Words that appear in similar contexts end up in similar positions in that space. The geometry of the space encodes semantic relationships. When you vectorize a word, when you word-to-vec it, you produce what is technically called a point in a high-dimensional embedding space. But it's not just a point, because the relationships between points produce directions, distances, and surfaces. It's a point on a plane. And the plane is not flat. It's embedded in a multi-dimensional. It's embedded in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Point, plane. And then there is the vector dimension, the directionality, the movement, the way that one linguistic position implies a trajectory toward related positions in that space. So, linguistic, because we're talking about language specifically, about how language is parameterized and embedded. Point plane, because vectorizing language produces a position in a multidimensional relational space, not a simple two-dimensional map. Vector, because that position carries dimensionality. So remember, linguistic, because we're talking about language specifically, about how language is parameterized and embedded. Point plain, because vectorizing language produces a position in a multidimensional relational space, not a simple two-dimensional map. Vector, because that position carries directionality, movement, semantic trajectory. Linguistic, point, plain, vector. And here is why it needs that level of specificity. When you perform a search on YouTube, when you type a phrase into the search bar, you are not just typing a keyword. You are invoking a linguistic structure that the platform's search infrastructure processed as a vectorized representation. Your search term gets embedded in semantic space. The result it surfaces are determined by how that embedded position relates to the embedded positions of titles, descriptions, transcripts, and tags in the platform's index. If you treat your search term as just a keyword, you're missing most of what's happening. You're missing the fact that the word you chose, the phrase you construct, the positions you. You're missing the fact that the word you chose, the phrase you construct, positions you in a semantic space, and that position determines what the hypergraph lattice surfaces in response. A linguistic point plane vector is anything that occupies that position: a search query, a playlist title, a video title, a thumbnail text, a piece of language that has been or will be embedded in semantic space and used as a retrieval anchor. It's a keyword, yes, but it's a keyword plus the understanding of what happens when that keyword gets parameterized. It's a keyword plus the vector that connects it to every related concept in the embedding space. It's a keyword plus the relational heuristic scaffolding that surrounds it in the semantic field. That's what linguistic point plane vector is describing. That's what keyword doesn't cover. That's why it appears in the practice of curation at the level of playlist titling. Because the title of a playlist is not just a name, it's not just a label. It's a linguistic point plane vector that will be processed by search infrastructure, by recommendation systems, by the viewer's own pattern recognition when they scan their subscription feed. And when you crack the understanding of what a linguistic point plane vector is doing in your search journeys, in your playlist architecture, in your titling decisions, you crack the code on search itself, whether that's semantic search, whether that's generative AI-assisted search. The underlying logic is the same. Your language is being vectorized. Understanding that is operational leverage. Now we get to the hard question, the honest question, the one I genuinely struggle with. How do you teach any of this to someone who has no background in systems theory? Because here's the reality. The audience for As an Aggregator is curious, but they may not be coming in with graph theory or objective personality or word-to-vec or semantic embeddings as prior knowledge. And you can't just define terms, because definitions aren't built, because definitions don't build intuition. You have to find a concrete sensory analogy that makes the abstraction click before the terminology is introduced. I want to be honest with you. I struggled to produce that analogy on demand. For Hypergraph, is it a person? Is it a link between people? The link is the edge. The person is the vertex. But what about when one person is a link between two communities? What about when a playlist is both a thing and a relationship? That's the academic answer. That's not 11 p.m. talking to someone who's genuinely curious. For consume digest, what are you watching? And what is taking up your attention? That's close, but it misses the psychological dimension. For linguistic point plane vector, it's like a keyword, except it knows its own neighborhood in the concept sense space. Getting warmer, but it still assumes semantic space as a prior. So what do you do when the sensory analogy doesn't arrive on command? Here's what I've come to. The provenance story is the analogy. Every one of these terms has an acquisition trail. Consume digest came from objective personality, from the consume animal, from the grant function stack, from a years-long investigation into psychological types. Hypergraph came from Stephen Wolfram, from the Ruliad, from doing due diligence into graph theory and finding that playlists couldn't be described by its legacy vocabulary. Linguistic point plane vector came from semantic search, from word to vec, from understanding what actually happens when language gets parameterized in computational systems. When you follow that trail, when you hear where the term came from, why it was needed, what it replaced, and what it saw that the old vocabulary couldn't, you build the intuition. You don't build it from a clean definition. You build it from the story of how the concept was discovered. Entomology substitutes for anthology. Entomology substitutes for anthology. Entomology substitutes for analogy. The acquisition trail is the onboarding mechanism. And that's a different pedagogy than the most channels use. But it's the only honest one available when the concepts are genuinely dense. Which brings us to the last question, the one that requires the most honesty. Is there a risk in proprietary vocabulary? Yes. It can. Can it become a moat that keeps people out rather than a door that lets them in? Yes. And I want to be direct about how I actually calibrate that, because the honest answer is not flattering. I didn't sit down and design a specialized lexicon. I didn't wake up one day and decide to make the framework hard to assess. What happened is that I kept running into concepts that needed names. I kept encountering real, functional, operational distinctions that existing vocabulary was too blunt to capture. And I named them precisely. Because that's what you do when the existing packaging label is insufficient. Consume digest required that specificity because media digest doesn't capture the psychological dimension. Hypergraph required that specificity because graph theory and network and algorithm don't capture both simultaneously structure, right? Hypergraph required that specificity because graph and network and algorithm don't capture the both simultaneously structure. Linguistic point plane vector required that specificity because keyword doesn't capture what vectorized language is actually doing. The vocabulary exists because precision demanded it, not because gatekeeping was the goal. But here is what I have to acknowledge. The market clearing effect is real. When you encounter a framework built on terms like these, you have a choice. You can engage. You can follow the acquisition trail, build the intuition, let the entomology do its pedagogical work, or you can decide it's not for you. And if you decide it's not for you, that's information. That's framework selecting its audience, not by design, as an emergent consequence of precision. I said it. If you can't get on board with the heuristics, with consume digest, with hypergraph, with linguistic point plane vector, with culture commentary, with macro breakout cycle, micro breakout cycle, then as an aggregator probably isn't for you. And I'm not proud of that in the sense of taking pleasure in exclusion. I wish the framework could be for everyone, but it's built for a specific person. It's built for the super user, the high intensity content consumer, the person who is already watching more than 90 minutes of YouTube per day, 10.5 hours per week, and has been doing it long enough that they've started to notice the structure of what they're doing. They've started to notice that their watching isn't random, that their playlists mean something, that their search journeys have a logic to them, that there is a system operating beneath what looks like casual consumption. Those are the people this framework is for. These are the people already ready to move from passive to active, from consumer to curator. Those are the people this framework is for. Those are the people already ready to move from passive content consumption to active content consumption, from content consumer to content curator. And what As an Aggregator is offering is the technique, the heuristics, the vocabulary, the scaffolding to understand what you've already been doing and to do it with intention. The terms don't disappear in plain language, they don't simplify. If you tried to translate this framework into plain language, no consume digest, no hypergraph, no linguistic point plane vector, no culture commentary, no macro breakout cycle, no micro breakout cycle, you would lose the conceptual scaffolding that makes these distinctions viable at all. The distinctions that make these visible at all. You'd lose the heuristics built from years of integrating knowledge disciplines that most people never put in the same room. And that's true. You'd lose the heuristics built from years of integrating knowledge disciplines that most people never put in the same room. Graph theory and content consumption, Jungian typology and media behavior, semantic embeddings and curation practice. It's those cross-disciplinary interpretations and integrations that give the technique weight. Strip the vocabulary and you strip the weight. It loses its everything. What it loses is everything. So if you're still here, if you made it through the acquisition trails, if the etymology landed as intuition rather than noise, then you're exactly who this is for. The super users, the serious consumers, the ones already paying their debt to the game. This framework is yours. The technique is available. Listen, and you will get it. Thank you for joining us. What you've been watching on your screen is a quick pick in our social science series. This is the 4th entry in our social science quick pick series. It is a dynamic playlist so we can change the sort by date. In this playlist, it's dynamically sorted, but as defined at the beginning, this is a hashtag dynamic 2A playlist sorted by date, published, newest. Thank you for consuming. Thank you for watching. And I hope you can pick these terms up on your journey to become an active content consumer and hopefully one day a content curator. Thank you.